Hey guys, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher here. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, we're heading back to Hakim again because I have had multiple requests to cover this video and I actually asked you in previous videos if I should cover it, and it's been a resounding yes. It's called, Why Did the Soviet Union Fall? So it'll be interesting to see a socialist perspective of the fall of the Soviet Union, because it's very common that your interpretation of it comes from a Western perspective. All right, original video link is down below. Let's check this out. All right, these Hakim reactions have brought in an interesting kind of mix of response from you all about, his channel. There have been people that are supporters of his and kind of the things that he advocates for. And then there are people that have been very, very critical. So it's been interesting to see that kind of mix there, because it provides for some good dialogue. And anyway, let's check this out. So it says, this is a recreation of an older video. This is part of a process of redoing most of my older and far less pleasantly edited videos so they can be watched more pleasant experience when shared watch. Check out the literature recommended throughout this video. Excuse my voice, I'm sick. All right, why did they fall?
What happened to the USSR?
By the way, I should preface this. Usually we're going to hear from Western perspectives is probably some kind of mix of the economy not being able to keep up with, on the international scene at least, with capitalist markets, okay, like the United States. Also, the sort of Cold War expenditures, which so much military spending was going on that it led to those economic problems. Might also see, some other changes that happen in other socialist places where maybe you saw progress and people wanted to see more change. Maybe something like a China, they started to make some of their economic reforms, in the 1980s. Gorbachev and kind of the glasnost perestroika also being influential to that. Those are, again, common things that you probably see, but we're just going to see what he says.
Quite a bit of mythology around the dissolution of the largest nation of the previous century. Every side of the spectrum has given their reasoning, with some being more believable than others. Here I hope to show the common arguments and hopefully help you reach your own conclusions.
Because he's sick.
This video is a partial transcript based on the book Socialism Betrayed: Behind the Collapse of the Soviet Union by Roger Kieran and Thomas Kenny.
So maybe it's a, I don't know, saying a conspiracy, but a plot by Yeltsin and others that wanted to, see more, market reforms or whatever, control the economy.
Strongly recommend you pick the book up. It is by far the best study of the dissolution of the USSR that I've ever come across. Anyways, let's get into it. According to the book, these arguments can be broken down into 6 categories found in academic literature.
Okay.
Supposed flaws of socialism, popular opposition, external factors, bureaucratic counter-revolution, lack of democracy and over-centralization, and the Gorbachev factor.
Good. Okay. Nothing here is... This is the stuff that we see. This is stuff that often gets taught in just general education. I'm sure he'll emphasize maybe different things here. But I'm also hoping for, again, more of a maybe non-traditional take. That would be interesting. All those you've probably seen a standard,
Those that support the first theory think all strands of socialism, no matter how unique, are equally doomed to fail. Usually, they bring this down to the human nature argument, as flawed an argument as it may be, and appeals to the
meaning that the collective nature of socialism is against our human inhibitions. Do you agree with that, by the way?
Superiority of the free market. Human nature argument, as flawed an argument as it may be, and appeals to the superiority of the free market. Those that support this theory, or variations thereof, include Martin Malia, Richard Pipes, and Dmitry Volkogonov. Despite the many achievements of Soviet socialism, the system did have many flaws during the 80s. Issues with consumer goods, slow penetration of computer technology, falling productivity, differing levels of corruption, and the notorious second economy. Problems extended into the political sphere as well, where overlapping party and state functions reduced local overhead and kept political initiative at the very top. Of course, many of these problems arise from a myriad of other issues like the Cold War, the relentless economic and other warfare waged by the US against the USSR, and the heavy burden.
Embargoes, that's going to be big there. Western world blocking a lot of trade with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union did have to prop up a lot of other socialist states because, Cold War, it was, the world was a sandbox, and newly independent countries, because this all falls in with basically the fall of imperialism after World War II and the independence of countries, sought foreign aid either from the United States or Soviet Union, as they were the most likely to be able to offer some kind of services. So the Soviet Union had to, pick up a whole bunch of states and fund them.
From supporting allies
which
abroad.
Is a bigger chunk of their own money,
however, is that none of these problems were large enough to cause the fall of the Soviet Union. They didn't cause crisis, let alone collapse. To quote the book, the trouble with this theory is that it views Soviet history as unfolding towards an inevitable demise because of its departures from human nature, private property, and the free market. Though these views gained ascendancy in the US during the Reagan era,
was it inevitable though?
Subscribed to historical determinism based on human nature. In addition,
that's what I want to see him say. Was it actually inevitable?
This theory is utterly incapable, explaining how Soviet socialism survived the collectivization of agriculture and the German invasion of World War II, only to fall apart under the seemingly far lesser challenges of the 1980s. Nothing makes this clearer than Sovietological work from the 1980s, which in full confidence considers the USSR to be a force that's here to stay.
That's one thing to bring up, and I guess he did kind of in those top 6. Didn't he say what counter-revolutions? Could be the kind of cultural diversity, you know, that was in the Soviet Union lended itself to self-determination movements. Again, a big one would be Islamic countries and Eastern European countries that didn't necessarily want to, you know, just be puppets of the Soviet Union.
For a deeper dive, take a look at these 2 videos here.
Place they've had, you know, history against.
The second theory suggests that popular opposition to the Soviet system brought it down. Although no one explicitly holds this opinion, it's frequently cited as a major reason. They include things like intellectual dissidence, protests, the rise of nationalists, and the relative electoral success of non-communist officials in the latter era. This line of thinking isn't entirely wrong, as many Soviet economists did favor market reforms, and these opinions influenced that of Gorbachev's. Other examples include the Georgian and Azerbaijani protests, the upheaval in the Baltic republics, minor strikes, and the unopposed activity of non-communist officials in high government positions. The problem with this theory is that popular discontent came up towards the end of Gorbachev's reforms, not before. True. These upheavals occurred...
Well, that's... I mean, what about, like, Hungarian Revolution? Something like that. I mean, there's stuff going back to, like, the 50s, and, I mean, I guess you got the late... workers' unions. So no, I mean, there were a bunch at the end, but there were things like this all the time.
In response to Gorbachev's policies. In clearer terms, not before. These upheavals occurred in response to Gorbachev's policies. In clearer terms, those policies caused these issues. In the final analysis, popular opposition acted as a dependent rather than an independent variable.
Was he trying to say there that those were responses against Gorbachev? I mean, yes, but not in the way that maybe you might think. Like, you know, there were people, the famous thing that they say about Gorbachev is, you know, like Glasnost and Perestroika opened up the country and reduced some bureaucracy. And some people say it went too far. And then, so there's people like protesting and it went too far. But then there's people basically protesting that's not going far enough, that they wanted more liberalization.
A byproduct of Gorbachev's policies rather than their cause. This is further strengthened by the prevalent resistance of the Soviet people against dissolving the Union, as in Chapter 6 of this very book.
By some.
Shemansky's work, too, here is relevant if you're interested in further reading.
What I'll be honest, I don't know what is there a number we can put on about just the general population about it being more supportive of keeping the Soviet Union together or against it? I mean, you're talking about a system that wasn't going to just straight up vote on it. You still had councils and you had those different, you know, the different Soviets, I guess you would call, and kind of they end up choosing on their own. But if you're talking about like a direct democracy type of voting, that kind of data is not going to be available.
According to the third theory, external factors rooted in the Cold War and the global economy caused the Soviet collapse. Extreme opinions go as far as to say that the betrayal of Soviet socialism was due to the CIA's penetration.
I love that statue, by the way. It's cool.
Now, the extent of this penetration was far worse than you may realize. According to one later report, by 1985, the CIA and FBI had developed the most impressive inventory of spies against Russia in American history, and had riddled the KGB and GRU, which was the military intelligence, with moles.
To be honest, the KGB also had incredibly successful spy operations of their own. I mean, shoot, look what happened with the Red Scare. I mean, they didn't even have to necessarily even have a ton of spies, which they did. There was plenty of espionage all over the place, but just the thought of it ended up, we almost crumbled with, you know, like McCarthyism.
Still, unless further revelation shows that Gorbachev or Yakovlev served as CIA agents, it stretches credibility to suppose that the CIA brought down Soviet socialism. Nonetheless, external factors, more powerful than the CIA ever could be, were most definitely at work.
You're gonna root for him.
The intensification of the Cold War in the early 80s, followed by the World Recession in 1979.
That was a lot of that in response to Reagan, right? Reagan coming into the scene, calling the Soviet Union the evil empire, things that actually been cooling down, you know, in the 70s. And then Reagan ramps it up and kind of wants to put the end of it and put way more pressure that the Soviet Union had to keep up with, something Gorbachev also had to deal with.
Made American presidents Carter Cold War in the early 80s, followed by the World Recession in 1979 that made American presidents Carter and Reagan increase military spending, caused the Soviet Union to do the same in return. To quote the book, Soviet society never enjoyed the luxury of internal development free of the threat of outside aggression. The cost of defending itself and aiding its allies escalated yearly and drained resources away from socially useful domestic investment.
That is true.
By 1980, Soviet aid to its allies cost $44 billion a year, and our spending consumed 25 to 30% of the economy.
That's the biggest stuff you got to look at, is not just the total dollars, but more importantly is the percentage of your economy. Because you're talking about, again, the totals don't matter as much. Like the United States isn't going to need to be able to put that kind of percentage. And even that right there, isn't that on the lower mark of what it had been at its height? Hadn't it been higher than that at times in the Soviet Union? I wanted to say that it has been higher. But do you have that kind of, I don't know if you want to call it expendable income, but you know what I mean?
The strain of the Cold War increased during the late Carter and early Reagan years, the doubling of military spending by the U.S., the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is better known as Star Wars, the aiding of anti-communists in Afghanistan.
That was so funny because it's, if you don't know what Star Wars, essentially it was like U.S. saying we're going to develop like satellites that can basically like shoot down ICBMs, basically militarizing space that way. It was total fantasy, but there were legitimate steps taken towards it. My dad, for example, worked in semiconductors for years, and they were like developing technology for it. So like something was actually in motion, even though it never comes in. But more than anything, you know, the Soviet Union and people may not have known if it was plausible or not. So they had to respond to it in some way.
Poland elsewhere, initiative, which is better known as Star Wars, the aiding of
came out during Star Wars.
Poland and elsewhere, driving down the price of oil and gas on the world market, which was the Soviets' main source of hard currency used for trade, as well as engaging in various forms of economic and psychological warfare. Of course, all these played a significant role, but Francis Fitzgerald provides the most persuasive refutation of the supposed decisiveness of Reagan's policies at destabilizing the USSR. Okay. He argues that no clear cause and effect relationship existed between the external factors and internal crisis. For example, he states that increased US military spending under Reagan, for Star Wars for example, and other projects, didn't increase Soviet military spending directly. Many Soviet insiders likewise rejected the idea that the arms race caused either Gorbachev's reforms or the collapse. A Soviet official in military intelligence said, the notion that Gorbachev's perestroika was started as a result of Reagan's Star Wars was concocted in the West and is completely absurd.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see those two things. Perestroika is the restructuring of the government, basically making it less bureaucratic. So yeah, I don't see the connection necessarily between Star Wars and Perestroika, but it is a valid point if he does say that there is data out there that the Soviet Union did not ramp up its percentage of spending on the military. That is a fair argument for sure.
For the USA and Canada said, I am deeply convinced that neither the Strategic Defense Initiative nor the arms race in general contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Really?
Regardless
at all, though? I mean, maybe at that moment, but over the whole scope of things, they still had to keep up. The nuclear weapons, man. The Soviet Union for so many years was ahead of the United States, and those are insanely expensive. So, I mean, I feel like over the big picture, that's different than what he was saying, or if he was referring to her saying in response to the Star Wars plan. But that doesn't necessarily mean that accounts that there wasn't an attempt at a matching spending throughout the entire time period.
However great in whatever form, the external pressure coming from the United States represented less of an external threat than earlier economic sanctions, sabotage, and foreign invasion. More importantly, the external pressure did not dictate the particular shape and direction of the Soviet response. In the end, Gorbachev and similar forces' particular responses to the external pressures and internal problems provided the most decisive cause of the dissolution. External pressures and internal problems provided the most decisive cause of the dissolution.
Yeah. I mean, Gorbachev is completely villainized by socialists and people that were a little more supportive of the Soviet Union, basically calling him a sellout. And because this is also going to be a process where private industry is going to start to shift in the hands of, you know, his closest, you know, people. And as you know, today, as it's shifted, you know, the denationalization of so many industries was not just put into the hands of, you know, the people or whatever. Because you got to understand, only a few people in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union is going to collapse, could be able to, say, outbid, if you will, natural resources, say like oil. And that's why you see almost immediately the Russian Federation becomes pretty much an oligarchy, in the fact that a very small handful of people are going to get control of these formerly nationalized industries and are going to be billionaires. And if you know about Russian politics today, you have this kind of oligarchy that works very tight with, you know, Putin, who's been president forever. And they kind of feed off each other and kind of require each other. So that is one reason why you're going to hear a lot of pro-socialists really talk negatively about Gorbachev. If you're like a capitalist-minded person, you think this guy was likely a good person to push Russia into the right direction. Okay,
back to the video in just a second. Let's hear from today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. For a lot of research that I do for my videos, I end up hitting pages that aren't available in my location. That's frustrating, as you can imagine. Geo-restriction
from Iraq,
but not with Atlas VPN. For those unaware, a virtual private network makes
all
traffic travel through an encrypted tunnel. This way, it protects you from spying, public Wi-Fi dangers, and hides your IP address and your online activities. It even allows you to change your location for all your researching needs.
That'd be sick.
Developed by top cybersecurity specialists and IT engineers in 2019, Atlas VPN was created to make the internet accessible and secure for everybody. Currently, it has more than 6 million users worldwide, and boasts the best VPN deal on the market, with the most affordable online protection plan for just under $2 per month, if you can believe it, with a 30-day money-back guarantee. So, what are you waiting for? Go down to the description and click that link, and use my code Hakim to get a 3-year subscription for just $183 a month, with 3 months free. But that's not all. You get blazing fast speeds for streaming or gaming, unlimited protection for all your devices, an inbuilt ad and malware blocker, and you'll get to save some extra cash, as Atlas VPN will find you the best deal online from everything from your online subscriptions to airlines, hotels, and more. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount. It means you can get a 3-year subscription for just
yourself from the KGB. Dude, I would have
30-day money-back guarantee. Time is running out.
If this was my ad integration, I would have done something about, like, you know, protect yourself from the CIA or the KGB. Get a VPN.
So get your deal by clicking the link in the video description
Atlas,
below.
you owe me money.
Massive thanks to Atlas VPN for the sponsorship. This is what allows me to pay my editor fairly, so the support is highly appreciated. Alright, back to the video. A fourth theory is that the cause was a bureaucratic counter-revolution. The idea being that the bureaucracy itself became the base for a capitalist restoration, or that transformed itself into a new possessing class. This is more or less the arguments of Kotz, Weyer, Azad, amongst others, though some in this group didn't regard this new group as a class. Kotz and Weyer argue that the reform course launched by Gorbachev unleashed processes that created new coalitions that favored replacing socialism with capitalism, with Boris Yeltsin becoming the leader of the anti-socialist bloc. With the support of the party-state elite, quote-unquote, he was able to push aside two rival groups, the Gorbachev Socialists hate him and the CPSU Old Guard. Essentially, the argument goes that the breakup of the USSR as a multinational federation occurred because of the specifics of the power struggle between the Yeltsin and Gorbachev forces. Yeltsin's anti-socialists held power in Russia, while the Gorbachev social reformists held most of the union institutions. The Yeltsin forces concluded that they could maintain power and pursue capitalist restoration only by withdrawing Russia from the Soviet Union, hence the USSR fell apart. The bureaucratic revolution from above thesis is, however, not completely convincing. Such officials were, according to the book, incapable of collective action to defend the system, and incapable of consciously hastening its demise. The top bureaucracy, if you can use...
I mean, there was a coup. I mean, they literally did a coup and pretty much arrested Gorbachev.
Can be said to have enough substance to be consciously hastening its demise. The top bureaucracy, if it can even be said to have enough substance to be judged and an authentic social group
down in his house,
was too heterogeneous and scattered to act as a cohesive political force. Moreover, if the elite was capable of conscious independent action in its own self-interest, why did it back Andropov's Marxism and Leninism in 1983, Gorbachev's revisionism in 1987, and Yeltsin's free market shock therapy in 1993? This discussion is continued in the book. Klam Azad also supports...
I mean, there was... Well, I guess you could say it changed with Stalin. There were plenty of dissenting opinions about what Soviet socialism was supposed to look like. both before Stalin and, of course, after Stalin. The Stalin years, maybe not so much, because those guys ended up in gulags and stuff. But that was always a thing. People had so many different opinions about how it should go. I mean, go back to the old, Trotskyites.
Thesis that the bureaucratic elite fostered a counter-revolution. In his book, he offers a decent history of the accomplishments and limits of Soviet socialism,
The picture's so
but
cool,
argues
by
that
the
the
way.
real problems began with Khrushchev. The rapid consumption model and wage leveling adopted by the 20th Congress in 1956 sapped production incentives, created shortages, reduced economic growth, and fostered the black market and corruption. Khrushchev's ideas that the Soviet Union had begun the full-scale building of a communist society, adopted by the 21st Congress.
Notice he does those mocking voices. He's not a Khrushchev fan, not a fan of de-Stalinization.
1959 was overly optimistic, so a communist society, adopted by the 21st Congress in 1959, was overly optimistic, sowed illusions, and led to further wage leveling and stagnation. The adoption by the 22nd Congress in 1961 of the idea that the Soviet state had become the state of the entire people and the CPSU a party of the entire people signaled a weakening of the party in regards to the state and a growing predominance in the party of intellectuals and bureaucrats.
Is that one of the things that just the bureaucrats say? Like, we have achieved it. We are truly the party of the people. We have achieved that. Like, is there some kind of measurable thing where you can definitively say that? Like, we are officially the party of the people? Or is it just something the people in the party say?
In short, Azad argues that the Soviet Union's problems and Gorbachev's policies were the aftershocks of the mistaken policies of the Khrushchev era. Azad treats the Gorbachev period as a footnote to Khrushchev's mistakes, a part of the hiatus of 25 years in failing to implement much-needed changes, as a direct quote. In the view of the authors who wrote the book, though, the real problem was not the bureaucracy as such, but the second economy that had corrupted sections of the party and state, fostered a petty bourgeois mentality outside as well as inside the bureaucracy, and turned some bureaucrats, along with the second economy entrepreneurs, into a base for Gorbachev's opportunism.
This is where the people that say socialism was doomed because of some innate thing in our society that just the bourgeoisie and the development of a bourgeoisie class is just natural. Like, some people are going to do that unless you're just harshly intervening so that that kind of separation of class can't happen.
The fifth theory argues that the Soviet Union collapsed because of a lack of democracy and an over-centralized administrative system. In essence, a similar view to the...
Well, Perestroika and Glasnost were supposed to address that. Apparently they didn't enough, if that's actually a cause of the fall.
First explanation, with the difference being that instead of a critical flaw in socialism generally, it's only Soviet-style socialism which can be faulted. These types usually claim that the so-called lack of democratic institutions and over-centralization derived either from Stalin or Stalin and Lenin, depending on ideological persuasion. This view is widely held by left social democrats, Eurocommunists, the Demsoc crowd, amongst others. Historian Stephen F. Cohen and the Soviet writer Roy Medvedev also reflect this view, and so do many contemporary communist parties. This explanation is superficially attractive as it doesn't require any defense of Soviet socialism. To quote the book, to blame the Soviet collapse on a lack of democracy and over-centralization thus serves as a psychological or political distancing mechanism. It is a way of asserting that the socialist ideal remains pure and untarnished in spite of what happened in the Soviet Union. It says history does not matter. The actual experience of a socialist country does not count. The only thing that matters is what we supposed socialists or communists say today. What happened in the Soviet Union was there and then. This is here and now. Those Soviet communists messed up, but we're different and smarter. They were too bureaucratic, undemocratic, and over-centralized, but we either knew it all along or have learned it from their mistakes. As convenient.
Well, he has said repeatedly, and I agree, that what socialism or communism are going to look like in a place is going to be different depending on the place and the time and what the context was. What were things like before that? And every socialist state has not had the same experience beforehand. Say a Cuba versus a Russia, right? Russia had the Russian Empire and that peasantry, right? Cuba had years of colonialism and imperialism there by foreign powers, and then Vietnam similarly. So it's always going to be different depending on that. So yeah, this idea of what matters is what says here and now. I mean, yeah, I guess so, because every transition to potentially to socialism is going to happen for different reasons and is going to have different goals.
Into view as this is for those who wish to get their time on the next lecture, book promotion, or media interview, it leaves a lot to be desired as an explanation. It's unfalsifiable, has essentially zero explanatory value when applied to real events, and lacks so much precision that it cannot be either sufficiently proven nor categorically refuted to the taste of those that hold it as an opinion. To say that the Soviet Union collapsed because of a lack of democracy and over-centralization can mean only one of two things. Either the collapse occurred because the Soviet Union lacked the political and economic forms and practices familiar in Western social democratically governed countries like Sweden, i.e. a liberal democracy and a mixed economy, or it occurred because the Soviet Union failed to develop a new kind of socialist democracy and mixed economy hitherto unknown anywhere in the world.
Well, China had a similar thing. I mean, look at what happened in Beijing and Tiananmen. There you got pro-democracy, reforms being asked for and being protested for, but then you see, it gets squashed and the party will continue. It had already adapted quite a bit in the 1980s, under Deng, but yeah, I mean, it didn't fail them.
Both ideas fail as historical explanations because they rest on idealist constructs that attempt to explain history by the degree to which it conforms or fails to conform to an ideal. Modern historians, Marxists or not, believe that historical explanations must adhere to the actual details and contradictions of history. This precludes understanding history by measuring it against some outside standard. Furthermore, this train of thinking, where the Soviet Union collapsed because it failed to follow European social democracy, have another problem to deal with.
What?
It's clear that after a certain point, Gorbachev shared the same ideals as those theorists and tried to move the Soviet Union towards a liberal democracy with a mixed economy. Yet those exact moves are what led to a political and economic meltdown that has still not been overcome. This is an embarrassment.
Well, because it was so divisive. It wasn't uniformly agreed upon. Plus, Glasnost is supposed to open up the opinions of the people, so it was supposed to open up the idea that people could have a little more free speech, to be able to, form their opinions about what should be the future going forward. Is it going to be a mixed market economy?
That none of the lack of democracy theorists have been able to explain away. Furthermore, these theorists ignore the actual history of liberal democracy and socialist democracy. Democracy for whom and in what form, for example, economic, deepens the nuance but is rarely discussed. Refer to the book for this discussion. It's long to render here, but it's very good. Regardless, there was an active effort within the USSR from the earliest period to develop ways to increase the participation and control by the workers and peasants, including broadening membership in the Communist Party and developing Soviets, trade unions, and other mass organizations. Though the process of developing democracy was far from over, the Soviet Union had developed a variety of political institutions and practices designed to provide popular participation. The Soviet practices included using newsmen and ombudsmen as well as news sources, vesting trade unions with power over workers' rights, production norms, and the disposition of social funds.
Right.
Mick Costello's book is great on this topic if you're interested.
Wait, wasn't that supposed to be the things that were there from day one? If you are going to... with again more rights to workers and more decision-making powers to workers, but they're talking about this in the 70s and the 80s, decades after this all began.
Interested? Creating Soviets, production committees, community assemblies, governing committees of living complexes, and other party and government bodies. To quote the book, though many of these populist institutions atrophied during the difficult years surrounding the Second World War, they revived in the 1950s and involved greater and greater numbers of working people. Even under Brezhnev, popular participation in government showed many signs of vitality. Writing in 1978, when the Soviet Union contained 260 million people, a group of Soviet writers gave the following figures on Soviet political activity.
Okay, I'd be interested in this.
16.5 million communists, 121 million trade union members, nearly 38 million young communists, over 2 million Soviet deputies, 35 million people who work with the deputies in the Soviet's People's Deputies, 9.5 million members of people's control bodies, and 5.5 million members of production conferences of industrial enterprises.
Isn't this still really small? I mean, not really small, but quite small, though, when you look at the Soviet Union as a whole?
Of course, participation in a socialist Soviet, just as participation in a bourgeois election, provides no conclusive proof of popular control, but it nonetheless represented, however imperfectly, the striving for a kind of socialist democracy. Many of the traditional Soviet political forms, the newspapers...
So would that mean that, again, Glasnost, perestroika, not necessary? If there was a popular push towards social democracy?
The Soviets and the Communist Party itself were undermined by Gorbachev after 1985. Thus, while the majority of Soviet people remained opposed to privatization of property, the elimination of price controls, and the breakup of the Soviet Union...
Is that true? I fully, honestly don't know what data we have or can access about that, where he's claiming that, most people did not want to see this fall and to see the changes.
The traditional modes of expressing political views were evaporating. What this means is that the lack of democracy theorists could have been right, but definitely not in the way they wanted to be right. Relevant reading can be found in my book recommendations video on the topic here. The final theory is that the Soviet collapse was mainly due to Gorbachev. Unsurprisingly,
again, the thesis will probably be here. Well, I'm assuming for him, he went too far. But again, there was also the idea that it didn't go far enough to appease the Social Democrats.
almost all accounts give great weight to Gorbachev's role, with some accounts going further than others. According to the British historian Archie Brown, the dissolution of the USSR was greatly determined by a Gorbachev factor, as he called it, mainly Gorbachev's departure from communist orthodoxy, painting him as a heroic westernizer of sorts. Jerry Hughes thinks that Gorbachev was a free marketeer. Evgeny Novikov and Patrick Bashio suggest that Gorbachev was a crime-chain Eurocommunist. Anthony D'Agostino argues that Gorbachev was a Machiavellian wanting to maintain power by any means necessary. Though the authors of this book agree with the common elements of these views, that Gorbachev's ideological deviations played a key role, they nonetheless disagree with several other elements.
So the common trope here that is discussed is, and taught, is usually that, like, Gorbachev was trying to preserve the essence and the spirit of what Soviet socialism was. But these changes had to happen to save any type of element of that spirit. That those reforms were necessary to keep any of it, any of the old spirit.
Accounts that overemphasize,
like in education, that's often what is curriculum, I guess. But again, evidence against that, evidence for it. Let's hear it, right?
Obscure the extent to which he was not alone, but operated in a historical and social context. When he first departed from Andropov, Gorbachev represented ideas that nonetheless had precedent in the communist movement, mainly in the ideas of Bukharin and Khrushchev. These ideas had some appeal in Soviet society.
There were so many of these old dudes, like with Brezhnev and Gorbachev, that would go in and then they would just die. A lot of people forget their names. People kind of remember Brezhnev and then Gorbachev, but some of the other little intermediary periods of these just old party members, lifelong party members that were so old at this time, and then they get in and just die immediately.
These include the weakening of the central power of the party and the government, the legitimizing of private property, and allowing more freedom for markets, which had potency in the 1980s because they palpably reflected the interests of a dynamic, if parasitic, sector attached to illegal private enterprise. Thus, Gorbachev was both a successor of a certain tradition and the product of his times, not just a lone factor making history. Moreover, for some writers, stressing Gorbachev leads to them seeing these actions as part of a long-standing preconceived plan. The evidence, though, seems to point towards a shallow leader who acted rashly, impulsively, and contradictorily. Though his policies eventually formed a pattern of capitulation to the petty bourgeois, liberal, and corrupt interests at home, and imperialist pressure abroad, this was not evident at the start. Opportunism was his primary guide.
People, again, look at the state of Russia today and the oligarchy today as a sign that corrupt things were at play at this time with Gorbachev, and Gorbachev being the pawn of it all.
In the end, the story of the Soviet collapse was not the inevitable unfolding of a tragedy rooted in an impossibility of socialism, nor was it a defeat brought about by popular opposition or foreign enemies, nor was it due to Soviet socialism's failure to match up to some ideal of socialism that embodied liberal democracy in a mixed economy, nor was it primarily the story of the conscious betrayal of one man. Rather, it was the story of a triumph of a certain tendency within the revolution itself. It was a tendency first rooted in the peasant nature of the country that later showed up in a second economy, a sector that flourished because of consumer demands unsatisfied by the first economy and because of the failure of the authorities to appreciate the danger it represented and to enforce the law against it. It was a tendency that had manifested itself in Bukharin and Khrushchev before Gorbachev. It was a tendency that believed that prosperity, democracy, and its vision of socialism could come quickly and without sacrifice, without struggle, and without strong central authority. It believed in making concessions to imperialism, liberal.
Okay, he's going really fast. I'm trying to get this. Is he saying weakening central authority is what ended the Soviet Union? And thereby keeping central authority, it would have lasted longer? How long? Infinitely? Until communism achieves and becomes a purely classless, moneyless, stateless society?
And private property and the market. Some adherents of this tendency believed that they were true socialists, though they allied themselves with others whose true sympathies were with money-making and private property. Not until Gorbachev had this tendency in the revolution held full sway and been carried to its logical conclusion. Only with Gorbachev was the full mistake of this course realized.
That is the interesting thing to see, because we've seen repeatedly what the end of feudalism has looked like, and mercantilism has looked like. Even like hunter-gatherer communist communities, I guess, that we see in favor of things that are going to lead to more production. But what we hadn't seen is what was the goal, or what was the final phase, or what was the end of communism going to look like? That's what the Soviet Union, or at least the attempt of it, was going to look like. We've seen these other things. So, like he's saying, was the natural evolution for it eventually to break apart and go back to some kind of capitalist economy? Because that's what happened in feudalism. Feudalism was basically abandoned, or not really abandoned, but forced out pretty much in favor of capitalism. And however, not in all places though, because you can see feudalism go into socialism in the Soviet Union, but we've seen so many other instances, medieval Europe, for example, that happened. So is the logical conclusion of socialism, is it actually going to be towards free market capitalism? Or is it something that can be maintained? What's the end result of capitalism? What's the final of capitalism? What's that going to lead to? Marx says it's socialism that's going to be the end. Eventually, the difference between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat is going to be so big that the workers are going to pretty much be forced to rise up and seize the means of production and then push it towards a more classless society. Or is this all just cyclical and it's going to just continue to be centralized planning and decentralization, then centralization, then decentralization? Is that the infinite loop or whatever that we're going to see from time to eternity?
When it led not to a new kind of socialism, but to a new kind of barbarism, to quote the authors. In the case of the Soviet Union, Fidel Castro said it best: socialism did not die from natural causes. It was a suicide.
Did not die from natural causes.
That's all for this time. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. Really,
the suicide because it could not be saved, so you go down with the ship. Is that what Castro meant? All right, final thoughts. All right, you guys heard my thoughts throughout there. I asked you a bunch of questions. I'd love to hear your responses to it. But, well, I mean, you kind of saw his thesis, although I probably have to watch this again to really get it down, because basically he went through those 6 common points and said that almost none of them were major causes. But then maybe I missed a little bit in the final thesis there about what it really was, if it was more about corruption within the Gorbachev era. And that is something I know is talked a lot about, socialists. But maybe also, though, he was saying too that maybe there are small pieces of all of those there. And maybe it's still meant to be figured out, I guess. So anyways, what do you guys think? Why did the Soviet Union fall? What were the factors? What were the more important factors? And what were the lesser factors? Let me know down below. We'll see you all next time. Bye.